Hello to everybody. Thanks. Regards. Okay, Brett. I can see that you are now on.
I am.
Chat.
I am indeed, Giovanni.
That's great. I think we need to wait a few minutes.
Sure.
In order for everybody else to get in.
Yeah, no worries. Just tell me when you want to get started.
Yes, okay. I think we can start sharp at 4 p.m. GMT +1. That is the Italian time.
Okay.
Well, Central Europe time, let's say. Yeah,
okay.
I say Italian time because I'm in Italy. And I'm Italiano-centric.
Yeah, I understand.
And that is fine. And I think that I will speak less than 1 minute in order to introduce you.
Yep.
And after I can give you the floor, and you can introduce yourself more if you want, and your article. I already said it has a peculiar title. It is Wild Dragons.
Yeah.
And after you can speak about this around 10 minutes.
Yeah, maximum.
Or less.
Maximum, yeah, it'll be much less than that.
Maximum. That's great. And you can see as well if you would like to ask to your critics, to our participants, some questions. They have already read your article, so they already know what you must speak about. So it's also up to you. If you're curious about something, ask them. So that we can have a nice chat with in 2 cents you can interact.
Okay. Yep.
Let's wait a couple of minutes, and after we can begin.
Okay, perfect.
That's great. So it's 4 p.m. in Italy, in Central Europe, and this is our sixth appointment with Automatics. Today we are gonna discuss. I'm Giovanni Torrisi, as you already know, and today we are gonna discuss with Brett Christophers from the University of Uppsala about his article published on the International Journal of Urban Regional Research in 2014. The title of the article is Wild Dragon in the City, Urban Political Economy, Affordable Housing Development, and the Performative World Making of Economic Models. So now I'm giving the floor to Brett, so that he can have a word and he can speak. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Giovanni. Hi to everyone who's on the call. I don't think I've met any of you before. I sort of recognise some of the names. I looked through the participant list, but I don't think I've met any of you. So nice to do so, albeit only virtually. Okay, I thought I'd just talk really quickly about the background to the paper and kind of where it came from, because I think the context for it is in itself quite instructive. I consider myself basically an economic geographer and an urban geographer, and most of my work, most of my interest comes from a fairly traditional political economy perspective, I guess is the best way of putting it. But I'm someone who works from a political economy perspective, but who takes seriously some of the work that's been done particularly from other theoretical perspectives in recent years, coming from, I guess, for want of a better description, more cultural economy perspective. So I try and stick to kind of political economic principles and approaches while trying to embrace, where possible, other ways of looking at the world, and that's really where this paper is situated. Its specific perspective is that here's some bit of noise in the background there. Its specific perspective is that I do a lot of work on finance and finance-related issues, and if you work on finance, then in the last decade or so, it's been pretty difficult to miss the performativity research agenda associated with people like Kyle and Donald McKenzie in particular. So I've been aware of that body of work and have been reading it. So that's one piece of context. The other piece of context and kind of where the paper comes from is that at the same time, I'd seen a lot just in the newspapers actually from the UK about what had been going on in terms of affordable housing, so-called affordable housing in the UK, and in particular about the fact that in recent years there seemed to be more and more cases of new residential developments going up in various cities around the UK, where affordable housing quotas, affordable housing commitments and expectations were not being met. And this is obviously an interesting development in and of itself, and in a down moment, I decided to begin to do a little bit of digging around to try to figure out in a bit more detail why those obligations that are associated with new residential developments, and I talk about this in the paper about what those obligations and commitments are and how the planning system frames those obligations. I tried to do some digging into trying to understand why they weren't being met, and to do that I began to dig into some of the council documents, so the local municipality, local council documents, some of the planning inquiries that had evolved from out of the failure to meet these obligations. And almost immediately on beginning to dig into those documents, it became pretty clear that a lot of the discussions and deliberations around those affordable housing commitments and obligations were being framed in terms of this discourse of viability, and that a set of so-called viability assessment models were repeatedly being referred to when these questions were being looked at. So to cut a long story short, the paper emerges from out of the conjuncture of those two things. On the one side, being aware of this performativity debate in the literature, specifically on particular finance, and on the other hand, looking into affordable housing and seeing that a lot of the issues were being read and resolved actually through these models, and thinking, hang on a sec, I think there's actually some kind of connection here, and that's where the paper came from, was seeing a connection between a set of theoretical reading that I was doing on the one hand, and a kind of what started as a passing interest in a set of empirical issues on the other hand, and realising, hang on a sec, I think there's not only the possibility of a connection here, but that we can begin to maybe try to work with some of these theoretical ideas in this empirical context. And that's really what I was trying to do with the paper, was to suggest that actually we can turn to this literature and begin to understand what's going on in those situations in a more productive and in a slightly different way if we take that literature seriously. So that's where it came from. It was very, in a sense, it didn't emerge out of any kind of coherent research agenda or anything like that. It was very what's the word I'm looking for? Serendipitous, in the sense that the two things came together at that particular time. And it was a fun paper to make, and I just seemed like a pretty obvious place to try and publish the article. IGA being interested in, obviously, in urban issues specifically, and in urban development issues, but obviously encouraging people to try and bring new theoretical perspectives to those questions. So I think that's all I really want to say by way of background, and hopefully that's moderately useful. And obviously I'll be interested in people's thoughts on the paper, questions that arose from out of the paper, and hopefully we can have a discussion that is helpful and provocative for you as well as for me.
Thanks, Brett. This has been really informative. And now we have 3 hands raised, as you see from the screen above. Unfortunately, the first one, Abby Spinak, she's gonna pose her question or her comment now. She's not able to speak. This means that she will post in written her question. And in order to keep our audio file consistent, it would be better for us to read what she writes. Abby, can you post your written question now? Okay, so she's going to post it in part.
Okay, I can see that.
Brett, are you able to read the question before answering to it? So that after we will have our audio file, I mean, it's able to hear, to listen to the audio file without having also the text under us.
Okay, so do you want me to read the question out loud, did you say?
Yes, because otherwise we won't be able to understand what you are answering to when we listen of this session.
Okay, fine. Okay, and actually, if I read it, then I'll hopefully in reading it, I'll be able to absorb what the question's all around. Okay, so the question from Abby says, last week we had a fantastic session, well, that doesn't put any pressure on at all. We had a fantastic session with Alex Shafran about, which I hope I've pronounced rightly, about the reordering of urban space under neoliberal political economic constraints. And he kept coming back to the point that the urban has become the main site of the production of capital in the 21st century, as opposed to the factory, for example. Reading your article immediately after his, I was struck by your concern with the absence of the urban in the literature on economic performativity. It seems to me that these two observations are deeply linked. I'm curious if you think that the absence of the urban in this literature itself reflects a broader force at work that is explicitly interested in downplaying the role of the production of urban space as a main driver of capital accumulation. If so, what role has that process of obscuring the production of urban space and the urban more broadly as a site of production played in affordable housing policy in the UK? For example, your discussion of how the Three Dragons CRD model naturalises profit seems to be part of this work of obscuring. And methodologically speaking, should we be asking questions about the performativity of silences in economics, as well as the performativity of models, and how we might go about doing this? Another thing that occurred to me, and I'm not sure this is a question, more just an interesting thought experiment, is that if the urban is now the heart, the engine of the capitalist machine, then social housing is a much more politically charged topic than it used to be. Whereas it used to be part of a social safety net, taking the factory analogy, has become like policy that mandates worker ownership. Okay, so there's a huge amount, this is me talking now rather than Abby, there's obviously a huge amount going on there. And I'm going to, just thinking about the various observations and questions there, I'm going to say three things immediately come to mind in answer to this. And actually I'll preface this comment by saying that, you know, it's going to be impossible for me in this discussion to answer adequately all of your questions. In fact, it'll probably be impossible for me to answer adequately any of them, but I'll try my best. But what I wanted to say in that respect was that if you feel there are questions that any of you asked that I haven't answered to your satisfaction, then please feel free to just contact me offline by email or whatever in any other way, and I'll try and continue the debate. So, the three immediate thoughts that came to mind in relation to your question, Abby.
Just something. We have a forum as well open in your session, in which, if you want, you can keep in touch with all our participants.
Okay, fine.
So feel free to use that too if you need to, which is sometimes better than email, because all the arguments and all the issues are concentrated in one place. So feel free to use that if you want.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thought I had, which is about this question about the areas in which questions of performativity, specifically the performativity of economics and economic models, the realms in which those ideas have been mobilised and haven't been mobilised. I think in part, I'm not too sure to what extent, but certainly in part, it is a question of where people using those ideas are coming from principally, and most of them are coming from a sociology background, a particular economic sociology background, and some anthropology backgrounds as well, but particularly sociology. And it tends to be people interested specifically in finance. That's where it's coming from. It's kind of a financial sociology take on or extension of ANT for the most part. And I think just those people really, it's all a simple point. They just aren't really interested in urban questions. I think they're completely wrong in that sense, because obviously you can't think about finance as the huge literature within geography has shown without thinking about questions of urbanisation and the urbanisation of capital and the links between finance, capital, and things like mortgage markets and so on. But they're just the finance that they're interested in is a very virtual finance. It's a finance of on the screens, the kind of finance that people like Mike Pryke talk about these days, rather than the type of finance that Mike and others were writing about in the mid-90s. I think that explains it in large part. It's a literature also that, and I didn't get into this in this paper, it's a literature that the types of scholars that are more interested in questions of urban development and kind of gritty questions of political economy, those people have been pretty negative towards this literature. If you read people like Phil Morawski and other people, they've got some pretty biting critiques of this literature. So it's a literature that just hasn't been very, very positively received within the academic circuits, particularly political economy, that are looking more closely at urban questions. So that's the first thought. The second thought I had was coming back to where you started, where you talked about the urban becoming the main site of, I think your words were, the main site of the production of capital in the 21st century. It's a difficult one. That if you look at the long-standing literature, not just within geography but more broadly on capital and capital accumulation from political economic perspectives, the urban is typically conceptualized as a locus of surplus capital absorption, rather than a place where capital is being accumulated or produced. And I think one of the key questions that you're hinting at in your question is whether those, I guess, traditional Marxist conceptualizations that make clear divisions between production and exchange, production and circulation, and how those map onto different realms, whether those are still adequate. And I think the way you talked about what Alex was talking about, my suspicion is that he would suggest that those old conceptualizations are no longer adequate. I'm not sure about that. I still find those traditional kind of dualistic conceptualizations quite useful. I find it hard to get beyond them, even though I realise that there are good reasons to try and do so. And I also take quite seriously the arguments that if you're going to think about class issues these days, then you need to do it through a kind of an urban lens, very much so. But I think your question and the terminology you use in terms of production of capital raises some pretty major conceptual questions, because obviously, if you go back to Marx's value theory, then property, except to the extent that property is being physically produced, but beyond that, value isn't created in simply a property speculation and so on, because no labour's, there's no labour being put to work in that process. So there's some big conceptual questions there. The third point, where you talked about the one that I wanted to pick up on, was where you talk about asking questions about the performativity of sciences and economics. as well as the performativity of models. I think that's absolutely right. That's obviously incredibly important to do, and it's actually, from my perspective, a very salient issue. We have in Uppsala next month. We have the annual Uppsala lecture in housing and urban research, and we have Ed Glazer of the Triumph of the City fame coming to do the annual Uppsala lecture, and we've been reading his book, The Triumph of the City, and the silences in that book are quite clearly performative in many ways, given his links with institutions like the Manhattan Institute that are thoroughly bound up with conservative think tanks and their role in the development, absolute active role in the development of American urban spaces today. So yes, definitely we have to do that, and I think also we have to talk not just about the performativity of silences, but also questions of non-performativity. So and I didn't talk about this in this paper at all, but I think this paper was a very nice and clear case of models and their mobilisation being performative in really interesting ways. But there are, and I've tried to talk about this in other papers, not to do with urban questions, but there are just as many examples you can find of where economic models remain kind of stubbornly non-performative, and understanding those aspects of non-performativity are very important as well. So that's all I wanted to say, for now at least, in relation to that.
Okay, so thank you. Abby says thanks a lot, and another contribution by Lydia Katia Simanzu, which I'm going to read so that Brett can rest a bit from his speaking. So
thank you very much.
After Brett can answer to that. So thank you, Brett, for your article, which helps understand the degree to which the specifically free dragon viability model has become a default element of contemporary land use planning process in London. Let me pose in the discussion of today a very naive question. You describe very elegantly the blending of the boundaries between wild and caged economics, between consultants and academics. However, what remains unclear is exactly who are the actual dragons and what did they respond to your critique, whatever you sent to the paper after or before. Have you ever contacted them during your study? I mean, as academics, we should analyze the significance and the implication of these diabolic relations of power among consultants and scholars in advising the public policies.
Yeah, I'm back now. That's a fantastic question, and I was reading it while Giovanni was talking, and I'm madly trying to go through some old emails, and the reason for that is that the answer is an interesting one, which is no, I never tried to contact any of the dragons, but when I published the paper, a good friend of mine who works in the urban geography area, he contacted me to say that one of the people involved in the development of the model, and I can't remember whether he was on the CRD side or on the Dragon side or both. I think it was actually both, and I'm not going to name any names, had actually been one of his supervisors when he was a PhD student, and he had a chat. So this friend of mine, he had a chat to that person, one of the developers of the model, to ask that person what they thought of the paper, and he'd obviously sent them that paper. And so I've actually just managed to track down that old email, which is from almost about a year and a half, 2 years ago now. And I think it's fine for me to quote this email because there's some great comments in it. He said, "Oh yes, I had a chat to X. I'm obviously not going to name the name, about your Dragons paper last month. He seemed mildly annoyed, but mostly confused as to why you had focused so much on their model. It was originally commissioned by Ken Livingston, and very little fuss was made about it. End quote. And personally, I think that's incredibly interesting, in the sense that he was kind of mildly annoyed, perhaps in the sense that the attention was not welcomed. But for me, much more interesting than that was the comment mostly confused as to why you focus so much on the model, which is, to me, says an enormous amount. I mean, presumably the confusion was because, even having read the paper and having been involved in the process of using the model, selling the model, benefiting commercially from the model, that person still couldn't figure out why it was important. And why I'd written the paper about it, which I think says an enormous amount, which you don't need me to spell out. So that's a fantastic question. So no, I haven't been in touch directly, but yes, indirectly, and there was a mild annoyance, but mostly confusion.
Okay, so thank you for your answer. Now, thank you. That's great. So we have a very good feedback. Now we have a question by Dylan Muhammadi, which should be able to speak. So I'm opening his microphone right now. Please, Dylan.
Hi, Dylan.
Hey, Brett. Hey, how's it going? Hey, thanks for your article. You know the article is a success if you've confused and annoyed someone in finance.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hey, so you argued the performativity of economic models. You showed, as Lydia pointed out, the importance of differentiated, caged, and wild models. You also demonstrated how viability and profit become hard-coded and reified in the urban. This is awesome. I'm hoping that we can speculate a little bit. You did this with a rather simple model, but you opened it up. You opened up the discussion to talk about like smart cities and the performative role of advanced algorithms. So my question is, do you see this as kind of a viable room for research? And lastly, how might the performativity that you demonstrated here relate to something like capital switching?
Okay, I'm going to respond very briefly, but then ask a question back to you. So, I mean, for me, I think there has to be. Do I think this is a viable kind of framework for more research? I mean, I would definitely hope so and think so. I think that, I hope and think that my article shows that there's mileage in thinking seriously about these things. I think one of my frustrations is that there's a lot of one of my frustrations with the work that's done within the financial world by people like Donald McKenzie, which I really like, is that the approach that he and others in the area take is very, very different from mine. So they dig much more into the specific technical details of the models, and much more also into the specific kind of mundane details of how those models are operationalized on a very kind of ground level of a daily basis. And I find those arguments, particularly McKenzie's, who writes in such an elegant way, really, really interesting. But that's my problem, is that I often get stuck at the point of, it's really, really interesting and fascinating, but so what? And what I was trying to do with this paper was not get too stuck in the technicalities of the model. And actually, one of the referees of the article, one of their main criticisms was, and I can totally understand this criticism, was that I don't talk enough about what's actually inside the black box of the model, and I don't get into that. And that's absolutely true, I don't, but it would have made a very different paper, I think, if I had. I tried to focus much more on the kind of the political economic implications of that performative work, and for me, that's what's mainly been missing, and I guess that comes from the fact that I'm primarily a political economist. So that would be where I hope that work would go. Your more specific point of when you talk about capital switching, I guess I'd be in order to answer that question, I'd need a bit of more clarification about specifically what you have in mind there. I mean, my understanding of capital switching is obviously just for the sake of everyone on the call, I'm sure many of whom, if not all of whom, will be familiar with that idea, but just in case they're not, it's an idea that's very closely associated with David Harvey and his argument that in periods of over-accumulation of capital, where capital over-accumulates in what he calls the primary circuit of capital, and this goes back actually to Abby's point about production and what we mean by production. But Harvey's argument that when capital over-accumulates in the productive circuit, i.e. the circuit where wage labour is exploited in the provision of products and services, that when not all of that capital could be profitably, reinvested in that primary circuit, then it gets switched into the so-called secondary circuit of capital, which is the production of the built environment, where value is, again in those classical Marxist terms, not actually being created. So that's my understanding of capital switching, where over-accumulated capital gets switched away from productive investment into speculative investment in the built environment that simply delays crisis tendencies rather than putting them to bed. So Dylan, what do you actually mean by, when you talk about capital switching in relation to performativity, what do you have in mind there?
I guess I was curious about the way that kind of these models might justify further investment within urban within cities. And I'm thinking, I understand that one of the points you brought up was that capital switching is something that's generally done in times of crisis. And I'm curious about the codification of a kind of continual crisis, a pure speculation that would rampantly promote urban development and urban investment. And I'm thinking more, I really appreciated the use of simple models that.
Oh, you've gone, I've lost you, Dylan. Did everyone else lose Dylan as well? Okay, I mean, Dylan
kicked out by the system, or he had some trouble.
Okay,
so
I can try and I'll try and make a very simple answer to that, which is to say that sure, I mean those institutions who are actively involved in executing so-called capital switches, like particularly financial institutions that are investing large sums of capital and deciding where to put that capital. Sure, of course, they're all using. Hi, Dan, I can see your back. Of course, those institutions are using financial models to guide their decisions. And actually, the one thing I would really recommend people looking at is there's a fantastic scholar in New York University called Mary Pooley, who some of you might have heard of, and she actually, her background's in literary history, but somehow she got more and more interested in finance, and so she teamed up 5 or 6 years ago with an ex-investment banker who had taken one of her master's classes at NYU. And for 5 years, they've been writing a book on the history of American financial modelling and how financial models have come to pervade almost every aspect of American society, increasingly over time, often without us knowing it. So a lot of the stuff that's going on in daily life that we, not for one moment, would we think of as being guided by financial models, are in fact guided by financial models. Models that often the people actually using those models have no understanding of how they work. And so the next year she's going to be publishing this book, which I think is going to be a major book on the history of American financial modelling and about the pervasive use of those models and the kind of, speaking to a point we had earlier about the various silences that are inscribed in those models. So, that's a more generic answer to your question, which is to say, I think these models are absolutely pervasive, and we have. I don't think we're typically as aware as we should be about how pervasive they are and how fundamentally they are determining what's going on in the economy. And sure, that applies to the urban environment absolutely just as much as to any other environment. So I would recommend absolutely people to look out for that book.
Okay, that's great. I think that now we have another contribution by Sarah Linama, and I'm opening her microphone so she can speak. Sarah, are you there?
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Great. So, hi. Thank you so much, Brett, for this article. Now, your point regarding the need to study the social and political materiality of economic performativity is very compellingly stated. But my question is going to return to the previous discussion actually on silence that keeps coming up now. I couldn't help but think how this research also speaks how alternative models for affordable housing or otherwise are unable to take hold. So could you expand on what the insights from this case tell us about how grassroots activists and other platforms for alternative urban economics are ultimately unable to perform, if you will?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm sure my answer to that will be entirely, going back to what I said earlier, will be entirely inadequate in the sense that clearly that's not something I looked at in this paper at all. It's not a question that I've really focused on at all in my own research. But my answer to that question is that, sadly, I think that part of the answer to that relates to the partly to, I guess, to what Ted Porter just calls trust in numbers, which is about the pervasiveness of quantitative knowledge is built in a particular way in political and social life, but more specifically to what's a very strange phenomenon in many senses, which is, you could say that over the last 10, 20 years, the role of economists and of economic knowledge that's constructed from a very mainstream neoclassical perspective has been becoming more and more evident. And you would have thought that, or at least you might have hoped that, given what happened with the global financial crisis and given some of the critiques that emerged in relation to the crisis around the power or alternatively the impotence of that mainstream economic knowledge, that influence might have somehow, ebbed away or become less influential. But I think actually, if anything, it's become more influential. There was I think, is it Prospect magazine, the very influential kind of, almost a bit like the New Yorker magazine in the UK, I noticed about a month ago they'd done a list of, I think, the 100 most influential or 50 most influential thinkers in the world today. And it was extraordinary that, a very high proportion of those big influential thinkers in the world today are economists. And not only that, but some of them are not very influential economists. And I think that speaks really, really centrally to the power of economists in our social life today, in our social and political life today. And I think that unless one is an economist working, either within caged economics or within economics in the wild, where the most influential economists in question are potentially working at places like the IMF, or they're working in the conservative think tanks that I talked about earlier. Unless you are one of those economists in a particularly privileged position, writing and talking and speaking from a very a very particular mainstream economic perspective, you're not listened to. And I think that's the reality of the situation. It was really interesting. I just noticed the other day, which I just thought of this as I was answering your question. It was fascinating that there's this another new uproar about the Piketty book, or Piketty, I'm not sure Piketty, how you pronounce it. And a graduate student at MIT has come out and come out with this critique of Piketty's book that a lot of people in the economics blogosphere have picked up on and said, yeah, actually, this critique is a very serious critique, and actually throws into question a lot of what Piketty has argued. And I'm not interested in the particulars, but the point I want to make is actually, all sorts of commentators from heterodox perspectives, be they Marxian, post-Keynes and whatever, have been making exactly the same critique for the last year and a half without anyone within the mainstream economics community listening. But so that critique only becomes valid, it only becomes worthwhile, it only becomes credible when it emerges from within the mainstream neoclassical community. And I think that's incredibly telling, and it speaks to the broader point which I'm trying to make, is that the silences and the powers that we're talking about are fundamentally framed by the prestige that it is or is not invested in different types of economic knowledge. That's my point.
Okay, that's great, Brett. Thank you. And Dylan says that he has lots of graph and correlations. And now we have another contribution. Maybe Sarah, would you like to reply something on this before giving the floor to someone else?
Yeah, actually, I do have just a quick comment. I totally agree about the point around the kind of the growing intricacies of influence, and I really do think that the kind of how this research, by kind of grounding a better understanding of materiality, could actually be of benefit to groups that are committed to building alternatives. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, Brett, would you like to say something to Sarah?
No, nothing more on that.
Okay, that's great. Now we have a comment by Kansu Chivelek, and I'm gonna read it. Thank you, Brett, for being with us today. You mentioned in your article, but I wanted to hear more about how different agents or actors entangle with each other, and what kind of relationships occur among the three dragons, company or other companies, with the consultants and the local administration, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Again, it's a question that I don't have a huge amount of insight to, but there are a couple of things that I'd want to say about this. So the first of those is that, to the extent that I grappled with this question in doing the research for the article, the one thing really that became clear is that when you're talking about, and the word you use, entanglement, relationships, interactions, and so on, between these different institutions, what was most striking of all is that the terrain on which that interaction occurs, certainly publicly, so in other words, certainly to the public eye, in terms of looking at council documents, looking at planning inquiries, and so on, is that the terrain for that interaction and deliberation is set. The terms for that interaction are set by the model. In other words, it's the model and the assumptions that are fed into the model that become the issues of debate. In other words, the debate isn't around questions around should there be affordable housing, how much affordable housing should there be, but the model and the viability that is or is not shown by the model becomes the primary framer, as it were, of the terms on which that debate can and cannot occur. So that was incredibly striking to me. The second thing that I wanted to point to was something that hadn't been so clear to me when I did this research, but I've tried to carry on reading, particularly through the news media, about what's been happening in this space subsequently. And what's really, really clear and pretty depressing is that people talk about revolving doors in relation to central banks and financial institutions on Wall Street and so on. It seems that you get very much the same thing within the community in the UK. So there's a real, and lots of people have been able to trace some of the connections here. There's very much a case of revolving doors of people moving pretty seamlessly between the developer community, so the people that are the institutions that are actually building these residential developments, so between the developer community, the consultant community, and the local councils. So there's plenty of people working in the local councils in the UK who come from a developer background. So while, I guess ostensibly, when one's looking at these questions, and this is the way I largely framed it in the article, you have the developers on one side and the councils on the other, with the councils nominally trying to maximise local affordable housing provision, and the developers, for want of a better way of articulating it, trying to minimise it. In reality, it's not that simple at all, because you've got people that are moving between those communities, and therefore, in a sense, it's a much more of a closed shop, and in a sense, I think we've got much more of a unified agenda than probably I was aware of at the time.
Okay, thank you. Kansu, would you like to reply anything to this? You can write, of course, since you cannot speak. And then after that, we don't have any other hands risen. So please. Okay. Wong and Lindsay Owen have just risen their hands. That's a good sign. And who among you two is able to speak? These are the preference. Okay, I will type my question out. So, Lindsay, are you able to speak? Okay, you are both in writing. So let's begin with May. So May, won't. It's your turn. So I'm gonna read your question. Okay, so that in the meanwhile, Brett can breathe. Okay, thanks for your through Performative article. Towards the end of the article, you mention how the economic models point to increase risk as the rationalization for higher profit margins. Could you describe more about how the economic models formulate or calculated risk in order to justify this higher profit, or the role of risk in the mobilization of economic models by various parties involved in affordable housing? Okay, now Brett,
yeah,
it's your turn.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Risk is something that personally I'm getting more and more interested in, because I think, and this is to start off this answer at a very general level, I think risk is something that has been strangely absent from a lot of the political economy literature on in general, but also the political economy literature on finance, with the exception of people like Mike Rafferty and Dick Bryan have done some good stuff on risk in relation to derivatives, and then actually within geography, Leigh Johnson, in a very different context in relation to climate change, has been doing some fantastic work on risk and catastrophe bonds. But in general, the literature on risk within political economy is pretty slim. I think that there's a simple, so when you say, could you describe more about how the economic models formulate or calculate risk in order to justify this higher profit? They do so in pretty, in formulaic terms, they do it pretty simply by running different scenarios. So it's basically a scenario modeling perspective where they input different assumptions for different key variables particularly around things like house prices, around things like the cost of acquisition of land and so on. And under different scenarios for those different variables, they look at the economic profit or loss output for the developer, and therefore they base viability on that perspective. So I guess, the role of risk is central in all of these models. I think risk is ultimately what they're all about. The way they mobilise it specifically, I think, is simply through scenario modelling, certainly within the models that I've seen.
My Tong, I think this is the pronunciation, I'm not sure. And would you like to reply to this? You can do also by typing in the chat room.
Yeah, if you want to type, one other thing I would say in relation to that is I think that one of the key questions that the political economy needs to really focus on much more in this context and in all sorts of other contexts is on the distribution of risk. And I think this is, the case that I looked at here is a classic case of those parties with power doing everything they can to shift risk away from themselves towards counterparties. That's ultimately, I think, what it comes down to. And if you're interested in that risk question, one of the most interesting books that's been published recently, I guess you could say in response to the financial crisis, is by, what are their names? Mian, these are their surnames, Mian, so M-I-A-N, and Sufi, S-U-F-I, who are actually fairly mainstream economists, but they've written this great book which argues that the problem with mortgage finance, the general model of mortgage finance across the world, is that the risk is disproportionately weighted to the person that takes out the mortgage rather than the banks that provide the mortgage. And their argument is for a policy change which in some way will enable a greater degree of risk sharing rather than the risk being shouldered by those parties who are least able to bear it and probably least inclined to want to bear it. So I recommend that book very much, and obviously in the residential urban development context, that's a very relevant book. So Mian and Sufi, I can't remember what the book's called.
Okay, that's fine. Now there is Mehi, which says, thanks, Brett, for your response. Now we have Lindsay Owen, which can post a question, and I'm gonna try to read it. In the meanwhile, May say thanks for their accommodations. So now it's the question by Lindsay Owen. I'm wondering about the case of models also shaping the creative city or creative industries you mentioned during the introduction of your article. Of course, that this is not the focus of this article, but you cited another of your publication from 2007 that sounded like an interesting comparison. Could you please explain how this phenomena differ from your Three Dragons performative analysis?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Yeah, you can't, obviously, as we all know, you can't escape discourses, models, studies of creative cities and creative industries and so on these days. So that article, very very briefly stated, what it tried to do was to try to understand a little bit more about why the so-called creative industries had become such a central, I guess, trope, focus of not only of investment, but also of kind of relatively uncritical academic critique, academic discussion, not least within economic geography over the last decade. And what I tried to do was to figure out at what point in time the creative industry should actually cohere as such. In other words, the argument was that industries aren't just born one day as being the so-called creative industry. Someone has to define them as such and frame them as such in order for their description in that way to be mobilised and to kind of travel further afield. And what the article looked at was how it emerged at a very particular point of time, for a very interesting set of reasons in the late 1990s in the UK, and how the model therefore travelled further afield. And I guess the reason for that was in a sense, it was very different from this article, but I guess the similarity is that my curiosity really is around, in that case, was around, why objects that so often are taken to be pre-given in their importance, where that presumed importance comes from, and how fairly carefully crafted discourses and ideas are central in the mobilisation of that putative significance. So the argument really that I was coming from was, there's so much work within both within policy communities and within scholarly communities that takes the significance of the so-called creative industries as read. And I guess the question I was trying to ask, why do we think they're significant? Where does that significance come from? Who has argued that they are significant? And what was the rationale for the development of those arguments about that significance? And that's what that paper was about.
Okay, Lindsay, you like to reply to this? She says, sounds interesting for the next edition of Author Meet Critics. Actually, this is, I think, the third editions of Author Meet Critics. Before we were doing just chats. Now we are also speaking. I think this is much quicker for the author, especially to express and to expand. We don't have any other raised hands, by the way. This what before was not happening. It was never happening because, of course, for typing you need more time than for speaking, and that's the reason why, even if the answers were very long, of course, it was requiring more time. We have Laura Wentz, which just has raised her hand. And Laura, are you able to speak, or should we? You can talk. That's a great news. Let me open your microphone, and here you are.
Yes. Hi, everybody. For the really interesting article, I'm not 100% familiar with the whole performativity literature from the economic point of view, but I know that a couple of German scholars, especially Christian Band, and published together on the performativity of markets, and I've read some of it's actually interested because there are not that many, or it seems to me that there are not so many geographers, economic geographers working on it back then in 2011, 2010. Why their work is a little bit absent, or you don't seem to engage with it. Opened your From Marx to Market article, and it said that you've engaged with Christian Berndt on the issues, and they might now. I'm just intrigued. On what points do you differ? So where is the debate sort of, or where are the controversies lying? Because I find your argument very succinct. agree with a lot of it. So I'd be more interested with this stage where it's at now.
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. So, a kind of an admission, which was that when I wrote this article, which I think I wrote it back in mostly in mid 2012, early 2012, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess scandalously was unaware of of Christian Byrne and Mark Buckler's work on the poor performativity of markets. Like all of us, I guess I don't keep up with all of the literatures that I should keep up with. But obviously I became aware of that work much more before writing the other article that you referred to. Yeah, I mean Christian and Mark's work is fantastic. They have lots of they have a series of papers in Progress in Human Geography where they talk about markets, marketization, and performativity issues. They have a fantastic paper in Environment and Planning A that won the Ashby Prize, I think 2 years ago, where they talk about these issues. I would say that okay, let's put it this way. I would say that I can't speak so much for Mark, but I would say that Christian's agenda is very similar, I think, to mine, to the extent that I have such a thing as an agenda, I guess. It's a very a way of expressing things that doesn't really exist. I would say that, and what I mean by that is that he comes at things from a very much from the cultural economy perspective, so much more from the sociology literature, much more from the performativity side of things. And as I said at the beginning, I come at things much more from the political economy side of things. But I think both of us believe that there is scope for productive dialogue between those two, I guess, sides, for want of a better word. And there is considerable scope for doing theoretically informed empirical work that draws on both sets of literatures. I guess the difference would be that at least I think I come at things much more from the political economy side, and he avowedly comes at things much more from the cultural economy side. And actually, he was one of the referees of that other article, the Geoforum article that you referred to, and he in his review of the first draft, he took me to task for arguing in the article that what I was trying to do was develop a dialogue. And in his review, he said something like, "Well, a dialogue allows both sides to speak, but you're only really allowing the political economy side to speak," which I think was probably a true and fair criticism. So I guess what I'd say is I am now very much more aware of their work. I think their work is fantastic. I would say that, within the community of contemporary economic geography, I think they're doing some of the most original and important and interesting work. But they come at things from the other side of the fence, which means they look at things in different ways and they focus on different things. And I'd say, they're not looking at the same things as as the kind of McKinsey people. They're not looking at the same types of models and the same modalities of performativity. But I think they are, like McKinsey, much more interested in the technical intricacies of the practices that they're looking at than I tend to be. Whereas I'm I guess, ultimately much more interested in the effects of those models and what the kind of social relations, the effects on social relations that are involved. They're more interested in I guess in the classically ANT way, in focusing on the actual, the nitty-gritty of what's going on a very granular basis.
Okay, I'm opening the microphone of Laura again. If she sees she would like to reply something or say something.
Yes, actually, no, just a follow-up observation on what you actually said, Brett. I find that we just thrash out the different parts of the fence the people are arguing from. So would you then be more concerned with sort of countering the critique that has often been brought to ANT reasons? It says, okay, your work is too apolitical. We're not, you're just a nitty-gritty, but the political ramification or the socio-political ramifications are not properly built into your analysis or your observation, and political analysis in the whole performativity of markets, and does it need to be stressed more?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. I think that critique that comes mainly from political economists of both of I guess traditional ANT and ANT-inspired performativity work. One of those critiques has always been that it's descriptive rather than analytical, I guess, for want of a better word. B, that it tends to focus on particulars and singularities rather than on abstractions and generalizations. And C, as a result of both of those things, that it's rather socially politically disengaged. In the paper you referred to, I drew upon an article that Noel Castro had written in the 90s, where he had tried to make the argument that the same argument I'd done, but obviously in a different context, where he tried to say the presumed antithesis between ANT on the one side and Marxism on the other in relation to nature-society relations and nature-society research was a bit of a false antithesis, and I'd drawn that in the Geoform article, trying to suggest the same thing here. But obviously it depends, and just in answer to that, the question about the performativity work in general, which I don't get into in this paper, it depends on how we understand performativity and how, particularly on how strong or weak a version of performativity we work with. So a lot of people who do work on performativity, and Judith Butler does this, distinguish between very kind of strong notions of performativity, which in the economic context would be that the practices, models, practices that we're talking about actually create the economic phenomenon, whether that's a market or something else. That's a strong form of performativity. A weak performativity, and I guess that's the type of performativity that I'm talking about here, is not that the model actually creates the phenomenon in question. So the model doesn't create the fact of affordable housing, but rather the use of that model, the application of that model, tends to make the assumptions that are ingrained in that model more rather than less true. So the more the model is used, right, the more that the model becomes an accurate representation of the world that it's trying to represent. And I think, and the reason for saying that is I think that the degree to which cultural economy type work and performativity can or cannot be reconciled with nominally more politically engaged political economy work depends on the type of performativity conceptualization one brings to bear.
Thank you very much, Brett. Now we have Anthony Lerenda, which is able to write. So he's going to write his question, and I'm going to read it. Is it all right with you, Brett? Okay, I'm gonna read it. Okay, I was wondering if you comment on the interaction and collaboration between wild and cage economics, a scholarly discipline. It seems that wild economics can eventually become caged economics, but not without contestation. What is the role for academics in challenging this process of caging wild economics that have inequitable outcomes, such as the lack of affordable housing?
Okay, so I think that unless I've misinterpreted you, I think here you're using the idea of caging to refer to some sort of kind of normalization of the models in question, where they become, they might be contested, but they ultimately become normalized in the sense of not being debated, and therefore they become caged in the sense they become kind of out of reach. If that's right, then your question, what is the role for academics in challenging that process? Yeah, it's a $1 million question. It depends on ultimately on what one perceives to be the role of academics to be in social and political life in general. If you think that academia should be critical in terms of trying to engage in the world and deal with iniquities, and if you think that's what the role of academics is, or at least that's part of what the role is, then sure, it should be challenging that process. If the role of academics is simply to describe and understand the world, then it shouldn't be challenging that process. It should be just trying to understand that process of caging world economics. Personally, I think that academics or at least some academics should be trying to challenge that process, because who else is going to try and challenge it? But lots of academics wouldn't agree with me. Lots of academics would say you should, keep the normative out of it and just try and describe and interpret the world. Whereas lots of other people would suggest otherwise. So I think ultimately the answer to your question is it depends on what you perceive to be the role of academics.
And we see that Lydia says, "Great question, Anthony," and Anthony confirms. He says exactly yes, of course, critical and engaged. This is the role of academics, in my view. I think my point is exactly that. So engaged intellectuals.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just as a follow-up to that, I think that my point has got nothing to do really with the specificity of what we're talking about today. But I think that, and this is something I'm more and more aware of, I think that the only thing worse than there being no criticism of economics and of the role of economics is bad criticism of economics. And one thing that I think lots of people on the left, lots of academics on the left, and including lots of critical geographers are bad at, is making sweeping pejorative assessments of economics without really understanding the specific nature of the economic discourses that they're looking at. I mean, I think that if you're going to engage with economics and with the power that economics and economists in the mainstream undoubtedly wield, it's very, very important to be very precise in one's critique, because otherwise in a sense, it defeats one's purpose in the first place. And I think that's the one thing that people on the left, with making kind of sweeping critiques of so-called neoliberal economics. What on earth is neoliberal economics? But we hear that all the time, and I think we just need to be very, very careful with the criticisms we make and the grounds on which we do so.
Okay, thanks. And I don't see any other recent hands. And maybe I can ask you about something. Since you are speaking about the relationship between intellectuals and political action, political economical action, what do you think about action research? So the idea by which doing research you change, and you want to change social reality indeed. It's not just something that you take a step backward and you just look at reality and analyze it, but it's also a way of engaging it and changing it somehow. Yeah,
that's a good question, and I'm not sure I have a very good answer to it. I've never really spent much time thinking about either the intellectual status or I guess the political ethics of what you refer to as action research, by which I think you mean research that is activist by its very nature. I guess in many ways, while I consider myself to be critical in the sense of wanting to always being interested in understanding what sorts of power relations are involved in the issues I'm looking at, and always trying to figure out what the outcomes are of those sorts of processes. I think of myself as actually as a pretty traditional academic in the sense of wanting to be normative in terms of the questions I ask, and wanting to be normative in terms of assessments of the implications of the conclusions that I come to. I think I try to, as much as possible, to keep judgment out of the process of the research and analysis itself. So, I don't have a straightforward answer to that, but I don't think it's necessarily, if I'm understanding you correctly, I don't think it's necessarily an unproblematic approach to research. I guess I'm traditional in the sense of, I guess, wanting to abide by, I guess, some kind of critical realist stance to the world that I'm trying to understand. But at the same time, I work with a lot, some of the PhD students I work with, that I'm working with at the moment. For them, they see the in many respects the purely kind of intellectual aspect of the research they're doing to be secondary to, in some sense, trying to improve the situation of the people they're working with. And I can totally understand that, and I can totally relate to it. But I think that it's, in my role in supervising that type of work, I find it very important to try to ensure that the work, I guess, conforms to the I guess, ultimately relatively traditional norms of social scientific defensibility that we've all grown up with. So I think it's a really paradoxical question to try to come to terms with. And that's my honest answer to that question. I don't have a better answer than that.
Okay, thanks a lot. Anna Rosa Cavalcanti, which I'm not sure whether she will be able to speak or not. Anna Rosa? No, obviously she's not, because she just posted her very long question. Brett, would you like that I read it?
I can read it if you want.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the question is, although I'm not familiar with this topic, I am interested in the argument of the application of economic models because there is a huge government program of affordable housing happening in Brazil, Minha Casa, Minha Vida. How would you think the scales of the economic model applications in relation to the massive housing development projects? For example, what we know from contemporary massive urban projects in Europe, such as IBA in Germany or Le Grand Paris in France, is that they usually both design and calculate their own affordable housing investment conditions. In those two cases, for example, there is a negotiation of conditions to specify the percentage of affordable housing within either mixed-use buildings, either in housing buildings, and so on. Finally, would you consider that the future financial models applied to affordable housing will be defined by agents engaged in these massive projects and less institutional? So I guess on my reading, that's a question about scale, I think, in part, and also a question, I think, about who is in control of these processes. talk about the developers both designing and calculating their own affordable housing investment conditions. I'm not sure I have a particularly coherent answer to these questions. I mean, just the thoughts that come to mind here is that one of the things that came out of this particular study that really struck me is that affordable housing seems to be well, two things. One is what we, and I think this is something we haven't talked about, but which in a sense is the missing subtext to the whole article, which is the whole notion of affordable housing itself, right? Which is that affordable in relation to what? Affordable is a relative context, and if you're talking about urban environments where market prices are themselves way out of relation for most people's incomes, then the very idea of affordable housing is kind of a stupid one in and of itself, because affordable for and under what conditions and so on and so forth. But the second one is that what I tended to see in this process was that what was really interesting was that when the terms on which these projects are developed become negotiated through the types of models in question and when questions of economic viability are put front and center, what was really striking to me was that when the models showed that developments were not going to be viable if they included affordable housing, what tended to happen was that you might expect that if that was the case, then the project would be scrapped or the project will be declined. But what tends to happen was that actually it's the affordable housing which is scrapped, and there's plenty of developments going through. If you just have to read the newspapers in the UK at the moment. There's plenty of developments going through now where there is no affordable housing, however you understand that expression, because the models showed that it wasn't viable. And I think that's it's an extraordinary case of the models scripting the world. So ingrained has the model become in the performance of that world that everything that is happening is kind of scripted by the model, in the sense that the underlying policy, which is about affordable housing, has and about the role that it performs has diminished so far into the background that the affordable housing element simply gets scrapped rather than the project getting scrapped. So I think that the design and the calculation are clearly fundamentally bound up with one another to an extent that I think is extraordinary, actually.
That's great. Anna. Hannah says thank you. So we are all right with that. And I don't see any other raised hands. Do we have any other questions you'd like to pose to Brett for his article? Otherwise, we have done almost 1 hour and a half. So we could even close our session now, because I see that Brett is very quick in answering and also always to the point. So he's very efficient in using the space. I mean the time allowed. So I'll just wait some seconds to see if other hands will be risen. Otherwise, I can always thank a lot Brett Christophers for this very nice section. It has been really great to hear directly from your voice your opinions, and I can also read it to other people. Thanks, Beth. Dilo is writing, thanks, Beth. It has been very interesting, and I appreciate your thoughtful responses. So as you see, you are very appreciated, and I can just thank you for that. And yeah, I hope to host you for also another session or for another section of Automate Critics next year. And I see that there is also some language I'm not able to understand by Olivier. I don't know what.
Swedish.
I think it could be Swedish. Would you care to?
Tack så mycket, Brett. Det var jätteintressant. Thank you very much, Brett. That was very interesting. Oh, now we've got lots of language. It's been a pleasure, but I really appreciate it. It's fantastic questions. I hope that my answers to at least some of them were useful and coherent. And enjoy the rest of the series of papers.
Thank you very much again, Brett, and see you maybe next year, or maybe in one of the several conferences about urban sociology, which are going to be held in. By the way, there is also a summer school in Urbino. I don't know if you knew and if you would come, but I'm in Urbino, and it will be a pleasure for us to host you.
I'll look into it.
Okay. Thank you very much again, and bye-bye. I didn't know that Olivier Roy Beyarcon was able to speak Swedish. This is
yeah, I didn't know that either. It's a great pleasure to see it.
That's great. And okay, so I'm closing this down, and thanks a lot also to everybody. You are always very active, and Automate Chris, it's wonderful. Also, thanks to you all participants and critics. Thanks a lot to you all and to Brett.